We'll take time for a quick Q&A. I think it'll be an interesting one. If you do need to leave, we completely understand. I'll kick you off by asking. Howard just said a vast change and a vast opportunity that China and the United States are recognizing and trying to harness. Vast change, vast opportunity. Alex, Peter, John, is Australian business and politics aware of the vast opportunity? No. The vast opportunity, the change and the vast opportunity coming. Are your members in your business association, are your members in Carbon Market Institute, is politics aware in Australia of it?
I'll make an opening comment on that from the carbon market point of view. To give you an example, I presented to 180 companies in Shanghai last year who are liable under the emissions trading scheme in the pilot scheme in Shanghai, and talked about the lessons learnt in the first year of the carbon pricing mechanism in Australia. And the slide that got all of the attention, maybe for 20 minutes discussion, was what professional services they procured to actually help them comply: legal, auditing, emissions management, accounting, etc. And so the demand for services that sit within the Sydneys and Melbournes and Canberras is phenomenal, just for that one slice of the opportunity that's emerging. The experience that Australian companies have had in helping large corporations comply is just one sliver of an example of, I think, where the opportunity is going to open up.
I've always thought that the response to climate change should involve something of a technological revolution, bringing with it a whole host of new business opportunities, jobs and so on. I don't like to start with the usual modelling assumption that it must be negative to growth and negative to standard of living and so on. Having said that, I think the business community has been pretty slow to recognise some of those opportunities. It's accelerating a bit now, but look at that, we've got a massive superannuation industry in this country, $1.8 trillion. Very small percentage of that ever finds its way into supporting anything you might think is going to make a difference in renewables, energy efficiency, alternative technologies and so on. So I guess they've been slow to go on this. There's been a lot of resistance within the major business bodies, to my mind, the Business Council and so on. You can say that, well, they didn't get much of a lead from the government over a large part of that time. That's true too, but I think that we are missing out. The comments that Howard made about the opportunities that are there, they're very real opportunities, and we can make a very big difference to where we sit in this country, both in absolute terms and relative to other players, if we actually embrace this technological revolution.
Thanks, John. I think just from the AIGN perspective, and our members are the big end of town, at the end of the day, it's the reality of what the market conditions are. It's those factors that will determine the willingness to invest. And to bring these changes forward, you're talking about significant investment, and the corollary of that is also the need for policy predictability, so that you'll actually know what the environment will be in 10 years. So I think some work that Anna did recently, ClimateWorks did, they highlighted that there had been a significant investment by the emissions-intensive industries in Australia, and for a period of time it was of world's best, and that really reflected higher energy prices in Australia, but also an environment that encouraged the investment. So at the end of the day, we would say get the environment right, get the market conditions right, and the investment will flow. Having said that, I'll just also probably just digress. Years ago, I was in a different industry. I was in San Diego, and I heard Craig Venter speak. Now, it was his team of 500 of probably the smartest scientists in the world who actually mapped the human genome. And they'd completed that work, and somebody said, well, what are you guys going to be doing next? And he said, we're actually going to be moving into the energy area, and my 500 people are going to be looking at the potential to get energy out of biomass. So I think there will be a strong place for technology solutions.
I've got quite a few questions here, and I think we're going to take two in a batch. You're first.
Right, Julie Chater, a question for John Hewson. Mr. Hewson, what factors do you think would be needed for us to arrive at some sort of bipartisan position on climate change and the need for meeting the sort of targets that the Climate Change Authority has put forward?
I'd like to say a guilty conscience on both sides, in the sense that both sides have squandered the opportunity that's there to actually do something together. You would think, I think most Australians would think, that this is an issue of such importance that the two sides of politics would come together and stop scoring short-term political points and see what they could do together collectively to get there. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years or so, that's become a very combative process, and they're still scoring points very much like they're still in university politics rather than actually dealing with an issue of such national, international significance. So I don't put a lot of hope on it, but having said that, look at what's just happened in the UK. I mean, where the three major groups actually got together and agreed on a particular position in relation to an industry that's been quite important in the UK, which is coal. So you'd never give up hope, but I mean, I'm not sure how you would get them to start that process, except perhaps the electorate challenging them to do so, but it's very hard to see that it will happen, in my view.
Jonathan Miller is my name. I just want to pick up on the final point that Howard was making, where he said that economic growth has to be part of the ongoing policy solution. I'd actually put it the other way around, that ultimately economic growth is part of the problem that is causing climate change and a vast range of other environmental problems. The limits to growth argument is indeed being played out at the moment, and the University of Melbourne research is confirming that. So I guess what I would like to, and it relates to the fact that our whole economy is based on the notion of exponential growth in what is ultimately a finite planet. What I'd like to put to the panel and seek comment particularly from John Hewson is a view as to whether what ultimately we need to be doing is moving towards a sustainable economy.
Look, I don't think it has to cost growth. I mean, obviously, we're struggling right now to adjust to the idea that we've got to have a lower rate of growth, probably closer to 1.5% to 2% than 3 to 4% that we got used to, now that we've moved on from a resources boom. But we've got a lot of rigidities in the system and inefficiencies that constrain our capacity to grow. And as I said before, I don't think anyone's really embraced the opportunities that are there just in relation to responding to climate change. It doesn't have to be, I think, a downside of the climate change debate to say that we've got to give up growth in order to solve the problem. I think we can actually have growth and encourage growth and still get a sensible response to climate change. We'll have a very different growth, different nature of growth. But look, in my own personal experience, we started this thing called the National Business Leaders Forum on Sustainable Development back in the late 1990s to educate the business community about the opportunities for that would flow from a sensible response to climate change. And very little came out of that process initially, but I personally got involved in a range of industries: household garbage recycling, energy efficient light bulbs. We built the biggest biodiesel plant in the world in Singapore, green data centres, coal refining, turning sugarcane into electricity and ethanol and so on. These are all very viable businesses, and all viable businesses without an international trading system and a price on carbon that would give me another income stream in all of those businesses. So, and make them extremely lucrative because they're profitable in and of their own right. So I just think we have such limited horizons in this country when we look at these issues, and we don't need to do that. It's not to say that we can go on growing the way we used to and take the sort of decisions we took, but I do think we can still grow and solve the problem.
Thanks. Just to add a word, when you look around the world, you could make the argument that countries like Australia don't need to grow because we're pretty prosperous as we are. But there are a lot of people who are not, and the developing world definitely has to grow. It would be iniquitous for us to suggest otherwise, I think. But John is absolutely right. There is a new model of growth, and it's being proven as we speak in an increasing number of countries. So, Jonathan, your question was sort of Dorothy Dixer for me, because I can talk about, or just mention, I won't talk about it, but I'll mention green growth. It's a completely different way of looking at how economies develop and what drives them and what lifts people out of poverty. The latest comprehensive expression of that sort of future that I've seen is from the New Climate Economy Commission, led by Felipe Calderon, the former President of Mexico. It's all on the web. There is one striking graph that I wish I could show. I did show a class yesterday. It's about resource efficiency, and it looks at essentially zero-cost activities which could deliver productivity improvements of $3.7 trillion a year just by simply doing things in a more efficient manner. None of these things is technologically impossible, and they're essentially zero or low investment, quick return activities. That's an example of a very different way of growing in the future within the planetary limits. That's right, it's resource efficiency.
Okay, Howard had been talking about legal aspects. We've just been joined by one of the big legal thinkers on climate change in this country, Martine Wilder from Baker McKenzie.
Thanks, Frank. I'm just going to make a couple of comments on this panel and the last panel. I'd just like your observations on it, if it's okay. We're obviously at the moment talking about very aggressive targets of 40%, like the Europeans are. And we've talked a lot about the significant opportunities that exist around technological change. But equally important is there's a huge amount of sunk capital costs in our major polluting industries. So therefore, no one's suggesting that we would shut those down tomorrow overnight. But if we're going to meet these sort of targets that we're talking about, we really have to have some sort of binding limitation on the major polluters to reduce emissions. Whether it's you're talking about an emissions trading scheme, a safeguard mechanism, or some sort of cap, you're not going to get to where we need to without having those measures. So I want to sort of test that, if you agree with that proposition, but it is the measure that everywhere else in the world is going down that route domestically. The second point is about, I perceive there's an increased need for action at home, because as we move towards INDCs, countries are going to want to be counting their domestic emission reductions towards those targets. So we're already seeing this playing out in the RED space, where Norway, for example, is funding a lot of RED development, a lot of early RED readiness work on the condition that they don't repatriate that carbon. So the challenge in the RED market, and Andrew talked about it, is that unless we have a global market that prices RED and countries are willing to pay for that well above, at a price which countries are prepared to let go for it, RED is ineffectively dead. Because at the moment, the only investment in RED was the early speculation, conservation finance, and now countries like Norway doing RED readiness. That then brings you to the issue of climate finance, which is that I think Peter or someone else mentioned that it's critical for the private sector to invest. And John, you made the point about that there's great opportunity. I think the reality is that the private sector is not interested in investing in a lot of these technologies unless there's money to be made. And I guess the thing that we're lucky about at the moment is that there is a lot of money to be made in renewables, in batteries, and a lot of the key players are now thinking about that and moving in that direction. And I think there's also a view that if countries start to move towards technology plays, they'll find they can probably leapfrog those INDCs quite quickly, because they'll put things in and it'll be a lot easier to adjust than normal. So there's just a few observations on what's been said. I'm just keen to get your thoughts on that.
I might start off, and I just sort of probably would take issue, Martine, with your comment that all countries are moving towards putting in place carbon pricing or whatever, because I think we're seeing a number of countries moving towards it, but there's still a lot of detail behind that.
So I mean in terms of those countries that have aggressive targets and are trying to put action to meet those targets, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right, that the countries have aggressive targets, but I think you need to sort of unpack what lies behind some of those. And I think, from our perspective, I think it was great that China and the US got together. And in fact, it was possibly a little bit disappointing that at Lima, that sort of mood didn't then flow through into some other areas. But I think we're still actually waiting to see some of the detail, particularly around China, what that'll actually mean and how they transition from the 7 trials towards a national trading system.
Look, I think I do this thing called the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, right, where we survey and rate the top 1,000 asset owners of the world, about $80 trillion worth of assets under management. 55% of those are put in climate-exposed, carbon-exposed industries, and less than 2% in low-carbon-intensive industries. That's a 55-2 punt against a climate-induced financial crisis, which is a staggering risk that they're running. And you would think that, but what we're seeing anyway is that these major players are now very conscious of the fact that we survey, rate them and rank them, and they're starting to respond. And in responding, they're doing it in a number of ways. In some cases, they're divesting from fossil fuels or coal in particular. In other cases, they're hedging or they're looking for a derivatives structure to manage the risk. And in some cases, they're investing more at the bottom in the low carbon intensive industries. Fix Super is a good example, who said to me recently, well, we decided to put some money into LED technology. We made 125% return last year, which dwarfs the losses that they made on coal. And so the market is driving it. A global price on carbon would definitely drive it, and it has a lot of the what you'd otherwise have to achieve by regulatory penalties and so on, if the price mechanism works. I think we will iterate towards a global price on carbon, probably coming out of an emissions reduction agreement. I guess it's one of the surprises is that financial markets have been so slow to move decisively in that direction. And I go back to the days where we had a very regulated financial system in the 70s, and we had the emergence of grey markets in foreign exchange and commodities and so on. And I'm amazed that hasn't happened to the same extent now, but it will happen, in my view, and that will collectively drive a change in attitude to investment. It'll drive look at coal. The world coal price is 50% of what it was. At that, it's still double its long-term average. Coal share prices of coal companies have fallen 80-90% in the last year. Japan just cut its coal imports by 50%. China's cutting its back. I mean, there's a lot of signals in there that are going to drive a price response in the market. We'll see investment shift. And so I do believe in the inherent value of markets and prices, market prices, but sometimes it takes an alarming length of time for that to happen.
I'll just make a couple of comments to echo that. I think we're seeing in the finance and investment sector clearly the way the carbon risk is being managed within the institutional investment community. It's moving ahead of where domestic policy settings are. I think we're starting to see with the global business community, with some of the initiatives that came out of the UN summit in New York last year, and some of the further commitments that we're seeing that were highlighted earlier today with We Mean Business, etc. We're seeing global businesses moving ahead of where domestic policy settings are, or irrespective of domestic policy settings. I think then ultimately on the domestic level it's going to be the mosaic as it evolves of different carbon pricing mechanisms and linkages that will evolve over time. Ultimately, if we haven't already got an embedded implicit carbon price, we're going to have an explicit carbon price in some way, shape or form in the future.
Could I just add one thing? I'm fascinated that the debate about carbon pricing in Australia didn't point out the fact that under the Direct Action Plan, there are implicit carbon prices. There's a price of emissions reduction achieved by planting trees or improving soil carbon or whatever. And some of those implicit carbon prices dwarf the one that was announced. We somehow didn't have that debate.
Okay, the final two quick questions, Jack Pezzi and Malta Mainshausen. I'm sorry, we won't get to.
Thank you. Jack Pezzi, and you. Question for any member of the panel about Australia's projected population growth, whether to 40 million by 2040 or 50 million by 2050 or whatever. I contend that projected population growth is a policy choice, not a fact of nature. Do you agree with Alex Gosman's implication that the rest of the world should or will allow Australia higher emission targets than would be otherwise because of our policy on population growth?
Malta, straight away.
Thank you very much. And since European delegations were mentioned, and having been a scientific advisor on one of them for a number of years, I can only confirm that the Australian delegation is seen as the technical and legal powerhouse in the UNFCCC negotiations, and this is really unquestioned. Like the Fossil of the Day awards that were in unparalleled numbers as well might be an indicator that maybe the broad brush policies are not always agreed as well, not with the stakeholders, but certainly from the technical expertise, I can only confirm that. However, my question is, your last comment was about the global nature of the agreement. Given that G7 is only a quarter of global emissions, G7, the industrialized countries itself, are not enough. However, the EU, US, and China would be half of the global emissions already, and G20 is 3/4 of the global emissions. So in how far does stressing the global nature of the agreement might be counterproductive in the sense that then we give the veto right to even small delegations. I don't want to name any Middle East delegations, but that with basically EU, US, China, and a couple of other willing nations, we have enough critical mass to go ahead. And so the imperative of Paris is to create a club of the willing without being bogged down by the lowest common denominator.
Can I maybe just a quick answer to Jack? Yes, of course I agree with Alex Gosman, but I just sort of say, one of the key elements of the INDC is actually the national characteristics, and all I'm probably really saying is, let's be honest about what are the national characteristics of Australia, and I think it's ourselves, New Zealand and Ireland are about the only sort of developed countries that actually have a rapidly growing population. So I'm just saying let's include that within our national characteristics. I think also, just to answer your point, I sort of think going into the future that it's as likely to get an outcome outside of the UNFCCC framework, and it touches on some of the issues that John talked about. I think one of the things that noticed at Lima there was a lot of discussion around decarbonisation. I went to the Jeffrey Sachs session where he talked about the work that Anna and Frank had done. But I think for the first time, you started seeing some of the pension funds come along, and okay, they were from Scandinavia, which is probably where you would expect the first people to come along, but they were touching on some of the points that John was talking about, risk around where their investment is. So I just think it's going to be an interesting environment going forward. 194 participants over an issue that is fundamentally important to every one of them. How high can you strike an agreement as against other forces leading to agreements?
If you see the UN process as pushing a top-down sort of process that's pushing and dragging, then I think the question of the veto is a really critical one. But what really the UN process is increasingly doing is cataloguing codifying, if you like, what countries have said countries are realising is in their interest to do. And so in that sense, yes, it's still a problem, but it's an ineradicable problem. That's the way the UN works. It's universal, and that means it's universal. So it means decisions are taken by consensus. There is one secret weapon this year, which I hesitate to mention, but one of the co-chairs, I don't know both of them, I've known one of them for 25 years, he is an extraordinarily effective chair, and skill in the chair, as we've seen time and time again at COPs, can determine the outcome. And Dan Riefschneider is as good as they get and as tough as they get, and he will keep his eyes on the prize all the way through, and that will help greatly, I think, with the problem of the minor dissenter. We would never have had a Kyoto Protocol, leave aside whether that would have been a good or a bad thing, but we would never have had one had it not been for the chair of the ad hoc group on the Berlin Mandate that developed it, Raul Estrada from Argentina. Brilliant chair, as tough as buggery, to put it technically. He was really brutal, but it meant we got there with not too much blood on the floor.
Look, I'm not sure. Population outcomes are a combination of policy and natural forces. I mean, we've had governments in this country that have given things like baby bonuses, one for dad, one for mum, one for the country sort of stuff. We all know how much nonsense that was and how it couldn't be sustained anyway. But immigration is an important element of our population strategy, and we need a pretty active debate about that. And the mix of immigration between refugees and skill requirements and so on. I think it's important when you look at how these international discussions might go, and I take Howard's point pretty important as a pretty important point at the value of a chairman. And if you look back at our role in Kyoto, we actually punched above our weight in the development of Kyoto. But I think that a lot of things can happen in these sort of negotiations. The chairman can make a huge difference to the outcome. Sometimes global events can drive an outcome, and I think there's quite a lot of that happening as well. So you may have the perfect storm of factors that actually drive an outcome, where it's more or less agreed that this is the direction in which the world is going, even though there are those that continue to doubt the role that they might play.
Okay, I think this afternoon was a significant contribution to the question of Australia's post-2020 climate commitment. Slides and videos will be available on our website. We will let you know by email if you have registered for this event when that will be the case. If you don't get our newsletters yet, please drop us an email to subscribe to the list if you're interested. Thank you all for being here and taking part, and a really big thank you to all our speakers.